One of the most exciting developments in the study of alchemy has been the recreation of historically accurate alchemical procedures in modern laboratories. Led by scholars like William Newman and Lawrence Principe, these examples of forensic history have allowed us an unprecedented peek back into the alchemical labs of history. Incredibly, even corruption of the manuscript tradition for specific alchemical texts, like those of John of Rupescissa, have even been corrected by such recreations. We can now even tell which manuscripts are correct by what we've learned in this forensic history. Indeed, what we've learned is that the alchemists were careful experimentalists, they were keen observers of nature, and they were experts in the production of equipment and management of laboratory conditions. And as I pointed out in the past, my first real introduction to the study of esotericism was through alchemy. It's my first esoteric love, one could say. So in that spirit, let's do another alchemical recreation. Specifically, I want to focus in on the intersection of alchemy and medicine, as led by the alchemical revolutionary and maverick and punk rocker Paracelsus, and his notion of spagyric medicine. So by searching through some authentic alchemical manuals of the 16th and 17th centuries, and using some pretty historically accurate equipment, some even custom made for this experiment, I want to recreate something of a kind of alchemical precursor for one of the most notorious drinks of all time. I want to create a 17th century precursor to absinthe as a cure-all for stomach issues. Though this spagyric concoction was meant to be medicinal, to be clear, specifically, as I said, as a kind of panacea for all stomach ailments, and who hasn't had those? So let's dive into the alchemical medicine of the mid-17th century and recreate an authentic spagyric treatment using the tools and techniques similar to those of that time. If you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the history of the occult in general, make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other content and topics of esotericism. Also, if you want to support my work of providing accessible, scholarly, and free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider taking a look over at my Patreon or pick up some of the cool merch that we have on the channel, or even a one-time donation via PayPal or the Super Thanks or whatever. If you support the channel just by leaving a kind comment, that's plenty fine by me and wonderful. So let's take a look at some of these alchemical recreations, and let's see if we can recreate something like Renaissance medicine with alchemy. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. So to recreate something like period accurate alchemical medicine, we need to get into the mindset and the grindset of how an actual alchemical doctor of that time would have thought and worked. And to do that, we need to cover a little history, a little theory, before then turning to our historical sources and running our experiment. Now, what I'm planning to prepare is an alchemical medicine, or spagyric preparation, to use the language of Paracelsus. So the question is, how did such a preparation even work in the mind of an alchemist of that period? Well, by turning to the 14th century alchemist John of Rupescissa, and ultimately really culminating in the theories and practice of the 16th century maverick Paracelsus, alchemists held that one could extract the quintessence, or spiritus, of a substance through distillation. This quintessence, or fifth element as it is, because it actually had its origins in the superlunar realm of perfection up there closest to the divine, and thus it had the ability to balance out the natural imbalances of the world of the four elements down here, in giving such an extraction radical, curative, even life-extending effects. For John of Rupescissa, the fundamental quintessence was extracted from pure wine distilled 7 times, what we still call aqua vitae, or the water of life, eau de vie, ishkiva, whiskey, etc. In fact, the term spirits for distilled alcohol goes all the way back to this theory of quintessence. But Paracelsus in his genius combined the herbal folk remedies of cunning men and women of his day with the most advanced alchemical technology of his time. People, especially women of course, had long known of the curative properties of various plants, herbs, and botanical. What Paracelsus argued was that by macerating those botanicals in aquavitae and then subjecting that mixture to distillation, one could extract the various spiritual properties of those herbs, of minerals, and of other substances, and therefore greatly improve their curative or restorative powers. It was like extracting out of them the spirit that could rebalance the imbalances in our body and thus cure us. And in a sense, Paracelsus argued for a combination of alchemical techniques traditionally reserved for minerals and metallic substances in the efforts to engage in transmutation with the herbal folk medicine largely rejected by academic doctors of that time because they were much more committed to the idea of the Galenic theory of balancing out the internal four humors through things like emetics and bloodletting. In his way, Paracelsus and his followers They basically invented modern pharmacology and paved the way to modern medicine. And that's what we're going to be recreating today, in some sense. The quintessence of several herbs, botanicals, and spices as a typical 17th century Paracelsian spagyric medicine. So with the theory down, the question now turns to one of protocol. What recipe do you use and how do you execute it? And that's where I turn to my own personal collection of authentic alchemical texts from the 16th and 17th centuries. Of course, the real place to start all of this in terms of alchemical medicine is Paracelsus. And here I'm consulting my copy of the complete works of Paracelsus and the opera of 1603 in the original German. I also have the Latin, which is interesting to compare the two. And as you can see, this text is just massive. 2 volumes bound in one, running into thousands of pages and covering everything from theory, medical practice, magic, and everything in between. But Paracelsus is key on his use of wormwood as one of the most important curatives for a range of stomach ailments. But there's a problem. Wormwood, second only to sage, is among the most bitter flavors in the world. It may cure you, but how are you going to choke it down given the bitterness? But his solution is ingenious. Rather than trying to cover the flavor, which you can't do, Paracelsus suggests combining wormwood with a range of other botanicals and then in a fermentation of wine, which is then subsequently distilled. This has 2 important perks. First, distillation carries over the spiritual essence and thus the curative powers of the wormwood, as Paracelsus reasoned. But also, distillation alleviates that otherwise repugnant bitterness. But the recipes in Paracelsus are frankly just much more suggestive. They're more vibes than they are practical. So we're going to have to get texts that are more practical, and to those we can turn to Paracelsians. To get more practical recipes from actual active Paracelsian doctors in the field, we can consult something like Johannes Hartmann's then definitive and famous Praxis Chemiatrica. My edition here is from 1647, but it was first published in 1639. The Praxis quickly became the definitive guide to Paracelsian medicine in the field, and this volume contains a host of recipes, various treatments, some of which are certainly lethal, and the specifics for the distillation of spagyric medicines, which is what we're looking for here. But the Praxis is also a fantastic textbook of this kind of Paracelsian medicine. And for a little insight into how alchemists of the time thought about distillation, I consulted the classic textbook on the topic, the Coelum Philosophorum by Philip Ulstad, which contains the combined wisdom of the alchemical titans, such as Arnold of Villanova, Raymond Lowell, Albert Magnus, and of course our guy, John of Rippositia, the quintessence guy. This text is also fantastic because it illustrates the kind of equipment that alchemists used back in the day, and thus the kind of equipment that had to have reproduced in order to make alchemical medicine properly, whatever properly means. Interestingly enough, my 1658 copy was previously owned by none other than Madame Blavatsky, co-founder of Modern Theosophy, so hopefully that will help somehow. Further, I'll be consulting Della Porta's famed textbook on natural magic, which provides further advice, especially on the practical side of things, and it's just full of all kinds of wonderful anecdotes, but specifically some alchemical cures. I also really like this famous textbook of Hermetic medicine, the Pharmacopoeia Dogmaticorum Restituta of 1608, which contains a huge range of such medicinal waters as it has it, including some famed protocols for dealing with melancholia and a range of other ailments. The melancholia one is one I worked on in this last episode of Alchemical Recreation. But Nicholas Culpeper's 1652, The English Physician, or later The Complete Herbal in my edition of 1666. We're going to take a look at this as well. But this text is fantastic because it allows me to peek into how 16th and 17th century herbalists, specifically alchemical herbalists, went about doing their work, especially in terms of things like specific astrological assignments of various plants. Finally, I'll be consulting this lovely little early 18th century guidebook to alchemical medicine that's actually entitled The Medical Pharmaceutical Emerald Tablet. So that's about as hermetic as it gets, the Emerald Tablet of Pharmaceutical Medicine. But upon reviewing a wide range of preparations, including plenty that are definitely just poison, including those that include things like heavy metals like mercury, which everyone thinks I'm a coward for not drinking mercury. Y'all go drink mercury. I've landed on an intriguing one from Culpeper's 1653 Pharmacopoeia Londiniensis for a spirit or water of wormwood, the greater composition. But why this one? As I mentioned in the introduction, I want to go seek out an actual early ancestor of the infamous spirit absinthe. Of course, absinthe itself was first developed as a panacea for digestion issues and stomach ailments more generally, and thus as we go further back in time, absinthe is less a recreational drink and more of a medicine. And again, who hasn't had a stomach ache? This is, I'm sure, a very commonly prescribed medicine. Of course, absinthe itself was first developed in the early 19th century as a panacea for digestion and stomach ailments more generally. And as we go back in time, it's less of a recreational drink and more of a alchemical medicine, and who hasn't had a stomach ache? Thus, this would have been a very common recipe to have been produced. But what's fascinating about Culpeper's recipe is that we find one of the earliest examples of what absinteurs call the Holy Trinity. That is to say, the combination of grand wormwood, anise, and fennel in one recipe. Thus, we find in this mid-16th century preparation an authentic alchemical spagyric medicine ancestor to what will become the absinthe of the 19th century Belle Epoque. So let's work through the protocol as Culpeper has it. It's called Spiritus et Aqua Absinthii Magis Composita, or Spirit and Water of Wormwood, the greater composition. For the recipe, we have take of common and Roman wormwood, of each a pound of each. Sage, mints, balm, lemon balm, and each of 2 handfuls the roots of galanga, ginger, calamus aromaticus, alcapane, and of each 3 drams. Licorice an ounce, raisins of the sun, stoned 3 ounces, anise seeds and sweet fennel seeds of each 3 drams, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, gotta have some nutmeg in there to get Townsend vibes, of each 2 drams, cardamom, cubebs of each 1 dram. Let the things be cut that are to be cut, and the things bruised that are to be bruised, all of them infused in 24 pints of Spanish wine for 24 hours, and then distilled in an alembic, adding 2 ounces of white sugar to every pint of distilled water. Let the first pint be called Spirit of Wormwood, the greater composition. So that's what we're going to look at, is that first pint. The opinion of the author Culpeper tells us is that it heats the stomach and it strengthens it and the lungs, it expels wind, and it helps digestion in ancient people. So at the core of the protocol is not only 1, but 2 types of wormwood. In this case, I'm actually using wormwood grown right here in the garden, along with an equal amount of Roman wormwood, which makes this, again, not surprisingly, the spirit of wormwood. It uses 2 pounds of wormwood, which is, again, at least with Roman wormwood, traditionally used in the process of absinthe coloration, not in the process of absinthe distillation. So that's an interesting difference. Along, of course, with a number of aromatic botanicals, probably used in providing flavor as well as their curative properties. We also find galanga root in this, which was probably imported from South Asia at the time and has a long medical history in that region. Further, several of the key botanicals weren't even to be found in England. Anise, for instance, was imported from the Mediterranean, and Florence fennel has a name, for that reason, Florence fennel. Not to mention the use of specifically Spanish wine. Thus, the preparation has a range of herbs, botanicals, and spices native to Culpeper's region, but also a further range of ingredients which would have certainly had to have been imported. Thus, such an alchemical medicine wasn't a recreational tipple at the bar or something like that, but a very expensive treatment reliant on a complex network of worldwide supply chains. Also, the inclusion of elkpain in this, which I'm going to call by its folk name, elfwort, just has solid wizard vibes, and you can't stop me from leaning into that, so I'm going to just call it elfwort. Lastly, and just as important, Culpeper has very carefully balanced out not only the specific herbal power, but also the astrological influence of each of the botanicals. Elfwort is, for instance, ruled by Mercury, and it's used to warm a cold and windy stomach, to resist poison, to strengthen sight, and to clear internal blockages. Calamus, which is also hot and dry in the second degree, it binds, stops the fluxes of the belly, and an immoderate flowing of the menses, whatever that is, a dram being taken in red wine every morning. Indeed, unlike the Venusian cure-all that I prepared for melancholy in the previous alchemy recreation video I did, this protocol is very much ruled by Mercury and Mars, giving it a volatile and active astral profile. Thus, not only are we extracting the quintessences of these herbs, but according to classic alchemical theory, we're also drawing out those very specific astral influences as well. So with a rather robust ingredient list, I'm going to combine all of these in the alembic, and I'm also going to be producing two slight variations of this protocol. First, I'll be recreating Culpeper's protocol, and given the rather large use of the botanicals, this is also going to mean I'm going to have to use a much larger alembic. First, given the botanical charge, I'll be using a false bottom to prevent too much in the way of scorching. I mean, this thing is positively filled with botanicals. So we go ahead and charge the alembic first with the botanicals and spices, followed by the Spanish wine. I'm also going to put this to a very mild heat to add in the extracting of the botanicals and to let this ferment, to use the alchemical language, for 24 to 48 hours. Culpeper would have probably himself been using a crock pot alembic, perhaps with a glass head or ambix, but by the mid-17th century, some primitive condensers would have been in use, but here I'll be using the classic worm style in this copper apparatus of Portuguese craftsmanship. Interestingly, this protocol only calls for producing a single distillation from the herbal infusion. However, following the alchemical theories of John of Ripicitia, such an infusion would have actually occurred in aqua vitae rather than just fermented wine. This is probably because, as we mentioned, aqua vitae was said to already contain the quintessence and thus the curative properties of the wine, and thus it was able to better draw out the quintessences of those botanicals and spices, thus intensifying their curative properties. Why Culpeper doesn't follow this more traditional alchemical procedure isn't clear. Even Paracelsus would call for that more traditional procedure, and that's saying something given Paracelsus' attitude toward tradition. It's not clear to me, but I'm going to produce a version using the same protocol, using both aqua vitae as a base and subjecting it to distillation, using this reproduction of a 17th century alembic made in glass. In fact, I've had this piece custom made for just such experiments. And notice here that we don't have an active condenser. Rather, the surface area of the ambix, or the head and the beak, alone act as passive condensers. Unlike my previous apparatus used in the previous alchemical recreation video, this one's actually made from modern lab-grade glassware, so it is much, much safer to work with. The other one's great to look at, but I was terrified of working with it because it was so delicate and could just explode from thermal shock. And this one's just made of modern borosilicate, so it's much less likely to, explode. Again, I'll be subjecting this apparatus to heating via a sand bath, and I'm curious to see in what ways the difference in protocol, both of which are attested in the various alchemical sources at the time, alter the final medical preparation. Of course, I'll issue the proper caveats for something like this. I have a good bit of experience in distillation and professional and in lab settings, and with these kinds of preparations, and I do not at all recommend trying this at home. In fact, please don't do that. Further, these preparations are not and should not be used for recreational consumption. They probably shouldn't be consumed at all. And this is an experiment in the recreation of historical medical alchemy, and thus not really for consumption, though of course I'm going to give them a very small try at the end just to see if they kill me, I suppose. But using a very gentle heat, again, we have to avoid scorching all these botanicals. We begin with the extraction, and this process takes several hours, and drip by drip we begin to see both apparati producing. And to be certain, the whole kitchen began to fill with a very distinct floral element, that of wormwood, but without the terrible bitterness that makes that botanical infamous. Even just stripping it in my kitchen, I could taste the bitterness in my mouth. But the aroma is a kind of earthy, sweet, and fresh straw-like smell. And to be sure, this concoction is positively packed with botanicals, making it a very dense herbal extraction more than anything else. And this makes sense given that this is, in fact, medicine after all. Now, I'm running both forms of extracts, with one on the larger copper alembic with the herbs and wine, and the other with a reproduction medieval style alembic using the aqua vitae infusion. Again, I'm surprised at just how efficient this little glass one is without no active cooling, just a condenser that's the surface area of the ambics in the beak. It's amazing that it works so effectively as passive condensers. That just shows you that the alchemists were incredibly smart in how they work. But as I said, the potion here is something of an ancestor to absinthe. It contains the Holy Trinity, wormwood, fennel, and anise. But given the ratios, the final product won't resemble the floral anise-flavored stomach tonic of the early 19th century. The ratios are just wildly different. Rather, this is basically a wormwood extraction with both Grand and Roman wormwood, which strips away that bitterness. Well, it strips away a lot of the bitterness. There will be plenty left behind, while leaving behind the apparently curative properties of all of these botanicals. And all in all, the extraction takes the better part of 3 hours. Again, I'm operating on very low heat here to avoid scorching this massive botanical infusion. The glass alembic produces about 200 mils of perfectly clear, astringent smelling extract, the very distinct, sharp, hot, and dry aroma of wormwood. And it's no wonder at all that that exact language is used in these old alchemical manuals to describe what you get. It's slightly viscous, probably given the substantial amount of essential oils now in suspension. And from the copper alembic, I take off the first pint as called for by Culpeper. That distillate is slightly yellow, incredibly viscous, and bearing the distinctly astringent aroma of wormwood, unsurprisingly. Even it's a bit specifically softer and earthier Roman wormwood comes through, surprisingly, just as much as the sharper Grand wormwood. So I split everything into 3 distinct groups. I'll take half of the Culpeper protocol and add the sugar that's called for. No doubt this will make the extract much less abrasive, but getting so much sugar into suspension was actually pretty challenging. It's a lot of sugar in this concoction. Of course, absinthe was served with sugar traditionally, with special spoons made for suspending a sugar cube over which water was poured. In this case, in the 17th century recipe, we have the sugar added directly to the distillate. Interestingly enough, both extractions produce the louche effect when water is added, again testifying to just how loaded with botanical essential oils this extraction is. So, yes, I'm gonna try them now. Not that anyone should be trying these things. Again, you shouldn't drink random stuff that you make from 400-year-old books of alchemy. But this is Esoterica after all. So, this is the part where I try these. Wish me luck. I'm going to use my little glass here from the Icelandic Museum of Witchcraft, which somehow seems appropriate to all of this. But here is the extract using the Paracelsian method, inspired by John of Ripicitia. So somehow also it being in this vessel makes it feel more alchemic-y. So here we are. I'm going to pour the tiniest amount here because I'm trying not to poison myself. All right, so you can see it coming out of the vessel here, that it is incredibly viscous. This stuff is the consistency of I don't know what like a simple syrup or something. It's really viscous, The nose is very astringent, very sharp. The wormwood coming through very powerfully, and not much else, honestly. There's so much stuff just packed into this. You'd expect this to be really complex, but at least in the Aquavita version, it's mostly just wormwood. A little bit of the grassy wormwood of the Grand Wormwood with the more earthy tones of the Roman wormwood. Yes, it's bitter. It's quite bitter. Bitter to the point in which you would not want to drink very much of this, and I don't know how you would even dose this out. Culpeper gives us no indication of what the dose is. And of course, from Paracelsus, we know that the dose makes the poison. So at any rate, it's very astringent, has a somewhat grassy, hay-like flavor. But in general, it's just wormwood. It's just like being punched in the mouth with wormwood. And in that way, it's very aggressive, very astringent, and very medicinal. This is not the kind of thing that you're going to go and order at a bar or something, God forbid. So it's not something that I could recommend in terms of flavor, but it is something that tastes like it would cure you. Also, immediately upon drinking it, you feel it hit the stomach, and it does feel like it's dry and warming. In fact, the palate is immediately dried out because of the astringency of the wormwood. All right, let's try the one distilled but without the sugar in it. Do the sugar one last. So here is the Culpeper version with no sugar added. Again, I split them into half and I only added sugar to one of them just to see what they would, how the difference with them would be. Again, I'm going to try just the smallest amount here. There we go. All right, my little Erlenmeyer flask. This one has a much more complex nose. The wine has given it a very specific aroma, much more earthy, much softer. You can still get that background bitterness of the wormwood, but again, a much softer aroma, more complex to be sure. Again, a much softer flavor. The wormwood, those grassy flavor of the wormwood comes through very much. I mean, it's like just rubbing your hands in wormwood and giving it a smell, but without that horrible bitterness associated with wormwood. It even has a kind of tea, like black tea kind of flavor, but again, very warming, very punchy, very astringent, very drying in the mouth, very sharp. Again, it tastes like medicine, but with a kind of floral hay-like quality, like fresh hay. So it has that kind of quality going for it, as much as that is a quality going for it. All right, let's try the one with the sugar added. And of course, the sugar is being added here, no doubt, to cover over this very astringent flavor from the wormwood. The sugar helping the patient, I'm sure, choke this stuff down. But again, we see it's incredibly viscous coming out. Of course, there's an ounce, a whole ounce of sugar added to about half a pint of the extract here. And the nose now is almost confectionery. It has a kind of caramel-like smell to it, even something like cotton candy, perhaps. But almost a confectionery kind of smell, now mixed in with the wormwood, which is a very startling kind of contrast of extreme bitter and extreme sweet, somehow meeting together in a alchemical marriage, one might say. But let's try this one now with the sugar added according to the protocol of Nicholas Culpeper. Very sugary, very, very sugary. Like I said, almost confectionery. It has like a flavor of, like I said, some like cotton candy or just candy in general. Almost an artificial flavor, I have to say. The marrying of the bitter wormwood and the sugary flavor is very unusual. And this way it feels even more like medicine, in the sense that it's trying to trick you. It's trying to let that sugar let you choke down what is otherwise a very medicinal, very bitter treatment. But, you know, if you had a bad stomach or your stomach's upset, this is not the worst thing in the world, certainly better than having a stomach ache. And I think, as they say, good digestion is the foundation of happiness. And so if this kind of stuff would have aided you in your digestion or other stomach ailments, especially apparently aids in digestion of ancient people, I think this would be the kind of thing that you would have gone and picked up from a local apothecary or alchemical doctor in the mid 17th century. So my last thoughts on this, what do I think about these compounds? They're interesting. I mean, it is an interesting kind of glimpse back into the world of mid 17th century medicine to give you some sense of what you would have gotten from a doctor. Also, did you pick up that great cheeky line by Culpeper at the end of the protocol? It says, "In this recipe we have their masterpiece. Left out according to art, as I commend them, for sure it was advisedly done of them not to write of what they never had." Clearly he thought well of this wormwood tonic, but poorly of the academic doctors dishing it out. True to the spirit of Paracelsus. Well, Paracelsus and Culpeper, I hope I did you proud by recreating a nearly 400-year-old precursor to something like absinthe, and one that transforms that dreadful bitterness of wormwood into something at least a bit more delicate, a bit more floral, if not a bit cloyingly sweet and medicinal. Well, I didn't die of this yet, so maybe I'll give it a try next time I have a stomach ache. But given my love of alchemy, I'm sure I'm going to be coming back to these old tomes to recreate more potions, poisons from the past. Any ailments you'd want to see an alchemical treatment for? Just let me know in the comments and I'll look through these texts next time I'm thinking about doing one of these alchemical recreations. But thank you for coming along with me as I recreate some of the alchemy of the past and hopefully not poison myself. But thanks for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, religion, and medicine, apparently.